are multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. So make sure you're confident with your operations and know how to do the written methods for those. Rounding, make sure you know how to round to the nearest number, the nearest 10, 100, 1,000, one decimal place, two decimal places, one significant figure, two significant figures, things like that. Estimation, so whenever you're dealing with estimation questions, it can be useful to round to one significant figure, so one digit followed by zeros and so on. In terms of order of operations, make sure you know the order of operations, so your brackets, then your orders or your indices, that's like your squareds and your square roots and your cubes and things like that. Then your divisions and multiplications, and then your additions and subtractions. So make sure you know the order of operations. Make sure you know how to order decimals. So in terms of ordering decimals, some students find it quite useful to put zeros on the end to make them all the same length as each other, and then just put them in order. Make sure you're confident with your arithmetic with decimals. Make sure you're confident with your multiples, so the multiples of 7, 14, 21, 28, and so on. Factors, so the factors of 30 would be 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6, and so on. Your prime numbers, so prime numbers are only divisible by 1 and itself, so 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and the only even prime number is 2, and 1's not a prime number because it has to have two factors, 1 and itself, so 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and so on. Square numbers, so square numbers and square roots, so your square numbers, so how to square a number, remember the little 2 above it, and that means to multiply by itself, and the square numbers, 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, so 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, and so on. Your square roots, that little square root symbol, the little square root symbol like that, that's the square root symbol. So if you've got the square root of 36, that would be 6 because 6 times 6 is 36. Make sure you know how to cube numbers. So remember the little 3 above it. So for instance, 2 with a little 3 above it would be 2 cubed, and that means 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. And know your cube numbers. 1 cubed is 1. 2 cubed is 8, 3 cubed is 27, 4 cubed is 64, 5 cubed is 125. It's also useful to know that 10 cubes are 1,000 as well. Make sure you know the cube root symbol, so the little cube root symbols, that is like the square root symbol with the little 3 above it, and the cube root of 8 would be 2 because 2 times 2 times 2 is equal to 8. Know how to write things as product of primes, so do your little prime factor tree, circle the prime numbers. If they say to write an index form, make sure you do the powers above the numbers. The lowest common multiple and the highest common factor, if you ask to find the lowest common multiple of two numbers such as 4 and 5, you could write down their times tables and find that it's 20, or you could use the product of primes, and if you do the circles, you'd multiply all the numbers in the circle to find the lowest common multiple. In terms of the highest common factor, if you've got two numbers such as 25 and 30, you could write all the factors out and find the highest common factor, which would be 5, the largest number you could divide them both by. Or if you do the product of primes, then you multiply the numbers in the middle of the circles where they overlap. Indices, make sure you know how to work out your squares and your cubes into power 4 to the power 5 and so on, and make sure you know the laws of indices, and we'll come back to that in the algebra video. Make sure you know your negative indices, so if you got something, for instance, 5 to the power of negative 2, that's the same as 1 over 5 squared. 5 squared is 25, so that's 1 over 25. So if you've got a negative power, put 1 over the positive power. Anything to the power of 0 apart from 0 is equal to 1, so make sure that if you've got, for instance, 10 to the power of 0, that's equal to 1. Know how to write numbers in standard form, so it's a number that's bigger than or equal to 1 but less than 10 multiplied by 10 to a certain power, and make sure you know how to write numbers in standard form, how to multiply numbers in standard form, add numbers in standard form, divide numbers in standard form, and be confident with tackling problems which may include numbers in standard form. Fractions of amount, divide by the bottom and times by the top. Adding fractions, so make sure whenever you're adding fractions, the fractions have got the same denominator, and if they're not, make sure you then get equivalent fractions with the same denominator. And if you've got mixed numbers, make sure you make them top heavy first and then deal the question like you would do normal fractions or fractions that aren't top heavy. Multiplying fractions, you just multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators, and again if you've got mixed numbers, make them top heavy and then just multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators, and if you've got a top heavy fraction at the end, turn it back into a mixed number. Dividing fractions, well, just multiply by the reciprocal of the fraction you're dividing by. Reciprocals, well, if it's a fraction, you just flip it over. If it's a whole number, then it would just be 1 over that number, and so on. Fractions, decimals, and percentages, know your equivalent fractions, decimals, and percentages, and know how to change a fraction into a decimal. Just divide the numerator by the denominator. How to change a fraction into a percentage. If you can get an equivalent fraction with 100 on the bottom, that'd be fine, or change it into a decimal and then change it into a percentage. To change a decimal into a percentage, just multiply by 100 and then put the percentage sign on the end. To change a decimal into a fraction, if it's got one decimal place, then it'd just be that number over 10. If it's got two decimal places, it would just be that number over 100, and then just cancel down. To change a percentage to a decimal, just take off the percentage sign and divide by 100. And to change a percentage into a fraction, just put it over 100 and then just cancel it down. To express as a fraction, you just put what you're looking at over the total. And then to express as a percentage, express as a fraction, then convert your fraction into a percentage. Next, percentages of amounts. Make sure you're confident with your non-calculator percentages of amounts. So to find 50%, divide by 2. To find 25%, divide by 4, or half it and half it again. To get 10%, divide by 10. To get 1%, divide by 100, and use those building blocks whenever you're doing percentages of amounts without a calculator. And then with a calculator, just divide by 100 and multiply by the percentage you want. Percentage change, that's change divided by original times 100. Simple interest, well, that's where the interest is the same every single year. So you just work out whatever percentage it is and then just add that amount on every single year. The percentage doesn't change. Compound interest, for calculator questions, I would definitely use initial multiplied by the multiplier to the power of time. For non-calculator questions, then you would do it manually. So for instance, if some money was invested at 10% compound interest for 2 years, you'd increase it by 10% to find how much is there at the end of the first year, and then increase that by 10% to see how much there'll be then in the bank account at the end of 2 years. Reverse percentages, well, there are questions where you need to find out what the original was. So I would often try and figure out what percentage you've now got, find 1%, and then find 100%. Or consider what multiplier would have been used and then divide by the multiplier. Ratio, know how to simplify ratios. So a bit like simplifying fractions, so simplifying ratios. Know how to express in the form 1 to n and n to 1. Know how to share a total out in a given ratio, so add together the numbers in the ratio and then divide the total by that number of parts and then find out how much is in one part and then multiply by each of the numbers in the ratio. Know how to deal with ratio questions perhaps whenever you're given one of the quantities, so divide by that and multiply by the other one and so on. In terms of currency, to change into the foreign currency, if it's in the form of £1 or so many of the foreign currency, multiply by the number in the exchange rate, and to change back into pounds, divide by the number in the exchange rate. Recipes, so if you're given a list of ingredients, know how to find how much you'd need for one person, two people, and so on for that list of ingredients. Negative numbers, so know how to add and subtract negative numbers, but also that whenever you're multiplying, two of the same, whenever you multiply two positives or two negatives, you get a positive answer, and if you're multiplying one of each, a positive and negative, or negative and a positive, you get a negative answer, and that's the same for division as well. Place value, know your place value. Know how to find error interval, so if a number perhaps has been rounded to the nearest 10, know how to write that error interval. Money, so if you've got any money questions, go to Corbettmaths and look at those money videos, but also whenever you're dealing with money, make sure that if, for instance, your answer is in pounds and you've got some pence involved, make sure it's got two decimal places. Best buys, so whenever you're dealing with best buys, it can be useful to find the cost for one of the items or 1 milliliter and so on and compare them, or you can find the cost for the same amount. Proportion, know how to deal with proportion, and also use of a calculator, be confident in terms of your calculator and how to use it. Tally charts, so make sure you know how to plot them and you know to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and draw the line going across and so on. Make sure you can do your frequency trees, so you know how to draw them and answer questions on them. Two-way tables, you know how to complete them, and then you can maybe also draw them whenever you're given information. Pictograms, make sure you know what the keys were so that you can draw the pictogram and also read a pictogram. Bar charts, make sure you've got your frequency going up vertically and you know what the scale is, and make sure that all the bars are the same width and things like that, so bar charts. Okay, next, frequency polygons. If it's on group data, you can just plot them and make sure you join up the points. Don't join up the first one, the last one, only join the first, the second, the third, and so on. If it's group frequency, make sure you plot them at the midpoints. Line graph, again, just make sure you've got your time going along horizontally and make sure you join the points, the consecutive points. Pie charts, make sure you can draw pie charts to add up the frequencies to get the grand total. Divide 360 by that total to find the degrees per person, and multiply each of the frequencies by that to find the angle, and then just draw your pie chart. Also, make sure you can read pie charts so you can answer questions, for instance, working out how many people, if for instance a quarter of them said yes, to work out how many that would be and so on. And make sure you're also aware that pie charts just show you the proportion and you would need to know the total to work out the values. Probability, make sure you know your probability scale, make sure you can write probabilities. Also, if the probabilities add up to 1, how to find some of the missing probabilities in tables, how to find out how many times you'd expect something to happen, also the probability of something not happening. Relative frequency, so the number of successes over the number of trials. List and outcomes, make sure you're systematic and you get them all. Scatter graphs, make sure you know how to plot the points, you know how to draw a line of best fit, and you know how to use your line of best fit, and when it's not sensible to use your line of best fit, and also your types of correlation, your positive correlation, your negative correlation, and your no correlation. Stem and leaf diagrams, make sure you know how to draw an ordered stem and leaf diagram, and make sure you put it in order, and make sure that you don't forget any of the values, and you've got a key as well. Make sure you can answer questions in terms of finding the range, the mode, the median, things like that. In terms of the averages and range, make sure you know what the mode is. The most common, the median, put all the values in order and find the middle value. If you've got 2 in the middle, find the middle of those. The mean, add up all the values and divide by the number of values. And the range, the biggest value, take away the smallest one. In terms of the mode, make sure you can read a frequency table and find where the mode is, or the modal class interval. The median, know how to find the median from a frequency table. So use n+1/2 to find the position of the median and then find that value. You could list them out if you've got time, but I would probably use n+1/2. If it's a group frequency table, you might be able to find which class interval contains the median, and then you can use n+1/2, or some people use n/2 because it's an estimate anyway. Next, the combined mean. So if you've got two different groups, how to find the combined mean. So multiply the mean of each of them by how many people are in each one of them to find the total. Then add them all up to get the grand total, and then divide it by the total number of people. The estimated mean, find the midpoints, times them by the frequencies to find the FX column. Add up the FX column and divide it by the total frequency to find the estimate of the mean. Okay, Venn diagrams. Make sure you can answer Venn diagram questions on wordy situations, but also make sure you know the notation that A union B means A or B, A intersect B means A and B, and an A dash means not A. Tree diagrams. Make sure you know how to complete the tree diagrams by writing the probability along the branches, and make sure then to find the probabilities, you just multiply along the branches. So if, for instance, you wanted a hit and a hit, you'd multiply the numbers on those branches. There may be decimal numbers, so make sure you know how to multiply decimal numbers, but also there may be fractions, so make sure you know how to multiply fractions. Reading tables, just have some practice with reading tables and make sure you can read tables. And samples, and know when a sample's fair and when a sample's not fair, and make sure that it's representative. Coordinates, so knowing your coordinates are along the coordinate upstairs. Make sure you put your brackets around your coordinates and put your comma in and so on, and make sure you also know how to plot coordinates and read them, and also to know how to answer questions that involve shapes on grids. Function machines, so if you've got the input, you just go through the function machine to work out the output, and if you know the output and you want to find the input, you go backwards and make sure you're doing the inverse operations. Writing expressions, so make sure you know how to write expressions and do things such as 2 times x to be 2x, x squared to be x squared, x divided by 2 to be x over 2, 2 less than x to be x minus 2, and so on. Know how to collect like terms, so I would actually go through and perhaps deal with the x's and then deal with the y's and so on. Know how to multiply terms and divide terms. Know your laws of indices, so whenever you're multiplying things with the same base, you add the powers. Whenever you're dividing things with the same base, you take away the powers, and when you've got a power of a power, you times the powers. Sequences, know how to find the next terms of sequences, know how to find missing terms, know your triangular numbers, know your Fibonacci sequences, so whenever you add the 2 previous terms to get the next term and so on. Know and also how to deal with questions that involve patterns as well. Know how to find the nth term, so see what it's going up by and write those multiples beneath, and then figure out what you need to do to those to get to the sequence, so perhaps add something or take something away. Also, if the sequence is going down, write the minus times tables and then think what you need to do to those to get to the sequence. Expand in brackets, so just multiply what's inside by the term outside, or if you got 2 brackets, multiply both of the terms by the first term in the bracket, and then multiply both of the terms by the second term in the bracket, and then simplify. Factorizing, make sure you can factorize by thinking on what they can both be divided by. Take that outside and then divide to find what goes inside the brackets. Factorizing quadratics, and with GCSE Foundation, it'll always be an x squared quadratic, so the 2 numbers in the brackets will times together to be the thing on the end, and they'll add together to be what goes in front of the x in the middle. Know your difference between 2 squared, so if you've got something squared, take away something squared, you'll do the brackets, you'll square root both things to find what goes in the brackets, and you do one with a plus sign and one with a minus sign. Make sure you know how to solve equations. Also make sure you know how to deal with letters on both sides, and also solve quadratic equations as well. Also forming equations, make sure you can form equations. Perhaps it might be to do with perimeter, it might be that you've got a rectangle and you know then the opposite sides have got the same length and you can form an equation that way. It might be to do with angles, it might be to do with ages or money or something like that. Practice those if you can. Inequalities, make sure you know how to draw inequalities in number lines, how you can solve inequalities and so on. Make sure you know how to draw conversion graphs and use conversion graphs. Drawing linear graphs, so the XY tables can be quite useful for those, and also know the x equals graph. So for instance, x equals 3 would be a vertical line going through 3 in the x-axis. If you had y equals minus 4, it would be a horizontal line going through 4 on the y-axis, and so on. Y equals mx plus c, know that m stands for the gradient, and then c stands for the y-intercept, to know how to find that gradient and y-intercept. So the y-intercept is found by finding where it crosses the y-axis, and the gradient you find by doing rise divided by run. Real life graphs, and knowing what that y-intercept will represent, perhaps the set phi, the set charge. Also the gradient would be something perhaps like the charge per day or the charge per hour, something like that. Parallel lines, know that the parallel lines have got the same gradient, so if you've got y equals 5x and y equals 5x plus 1, they'll be parallel lines. Substitution, know how to substitute values into expressions. Be particularly careful with negative values whenever you substitute them in. If you're doing subtracting a negative, you're going to be going back up and things like that. Changing the subject, so you approach that in a similar way to solving equations, but at least you don't have to work anything out, which is pretty cool. Simultaneous equations, so being able to solve simultaneous equations. So perhaps you need to multiply one of the equations by a certain number to be able to eliminate the x's or y's, or even multiply both of the equations by numbers to be able to eliminate the x's or y's. If both of the letters are positive or both of them are negative, you subtract the two equations. If you got one that, if, for instance, negative 4y and plus 4y, then you'd add them together to get 0, so adding those together would eliminate those. And then whenever you find the value of one of the letters, get that value and substitute it back into one of the equations to get the value of the other letter. And then also you can check it, which is pretty cool as well. Quadratic graphs, knowing how to plot and draw quadratic graphs, so being able to get those points in the xy table. Be careful with those negatives, be able to plot those points and find those U-shaped parabolas or N-shaped parabolas. You might be asked to find where it crosses the x-axis or y-axis. You might be asked to find the coordinates of the minimum point, that lowest point of the graph, or the maximum point of the graph, and so on. And also know the shapes of the cubic graphs and reciprocal graphs and how to plot those as well. Good angle fact, so the angles in a right angle will add together to be 90 degrees, in a straight line 180 degrees, at a point 360 degrees. If you've got two lines across each other, the opposite angles are equal to each other. They're called vertically opposite angles. Know your types of angles, so those are small acute angles, your right angles, your obtuse angles, the ones between 90 and 180, and the ones bigger than 180, which are reflex angles. Make sure you know how to measure and draw angles using your protractor. Obviously, make sure you've got your protractors, just double check now that you've got it. Angles and parallel lines, make sure you know that whenever you got angles and parallel lines, you might have lots of angles that are equal to each other and know why they're equal, so your alternate angles. Some people call them Z angles, but make sure you call them alternate angles in the exam. Also, your corresponding angles, so for instance, the bottom left is going to be the same as the bottom left, top left, bottom right, top right, and so on. So make sure you know those corresponding angles, and also make sure you know your co-interior angles, so those angles will add together to be 180 degrees. Angles in a triangle add together to be 180 degrees. Angles in a quadrilateral add together to be 360 degrees. Angles and polygons, well, you just keep adding 180 degrees for every single side. So a pentagon will be 540, a hexagon 720, and so on. You can use the formula n take away 2 times 180. That'll tell you the sum of the interior angles. Also make sure that you know that all the exterior angles will always add together to be 360 degrees. Also, the interior angles plus exterior angles will add together to be 180 degrees. And also make sure you know what the term regular means. So whenever you're dealing with a regular polygon, all the interior angles are all the same size, all the exterior angles are all the same size, and all the sides are the same length. Bearings, make sure that you can measure bearings. Remember, the bearings are measured clockwise from north, so you just measure the angle clockwise from north. Sometimes it will be a reflex angle, so make sure you know how to measure those as well. Make sure your bearings have 3 digits, so make sure if it's less than 100, you put a 0 in front of it as well. Also make sure that you know how to work out back bearings. So you could draw a diagram, or if you've got a bearing that's less than 180 degrees, just add 180, and if you've got a bearing that's 180 or bigger, you just take away 180 degrees, and that'll tell you the back bearing. Know your compass directions, north, east, south, west, and also north, east, southwest, and northwest. Also make sure you know how to do scales and map questions, and make sure you look at the scale and make sure you know what that represents. In terms of perimeter, that's the distance around the outside of a shape. There for a rectangle, length times width. There for a triangle, base times height and then half it, or half the base times the height, or half the height times the base. For parallelogram, just do the base times the height. The height's the distance between the two parallel sides, so it's not the diagonal, it's the height, that's the distance between the parallel sides. There for trapezium, that's a half the sum of the two parallel sides, so you add together the lengths of the two parallel sides, you half that, and then you times by the height, the distance between them. Area of compound shapes, make sure you split them up into smaller shapes and then find the areas of each of those. Units, make sure you know your imperial units and your metric units, and make sure you know your metric units in terms of converting them. Sensible estimates, make sure you know the lengths and masses and capacity of objects around you, and they'll be useful for your sensible estimate questions. Line symmetry, make sure you know your lines of symmetry and so on. Rotational symmetry, remember the order of rotational symmetry is how many times it lands on itself whenever you spin it through 360 degrees. Constructions, make sure you know all your constructions, in particular your perpendicular bisector and your angle bisector. Make sure you've got your compass and pencil ready for the exam as well. Loci questions, make sure you read those carefully and make sure you understand what you've been asked for as well in those questions. Your 2D and 3D shapes, make sure you know their names and also what faces, edges, and vertices are. So faces, they're the faces of the three-dimensional shape. Edges, they're the lines that join the vertices, and the vertices, they're your corners. Your nets, make sure you know the different nets of the three-dimensional shapes. Your parallel lines, they're the two lines that go in the same direction and never cross each other. Your perpendicular lines, lines that cross each other at 90 degrees. Views and elevations, make sure you can draw the front elevation, so that's the view from the front, the side elevations, and also the plan view from above. Time calculations, I find timelines can be quite useful for those. Timetables, make sure you're confident with your bus and your train timetables and things like that. Distance charts as well, make sure you can read those. Speed, distance, time, make sure that you know that speed is distance divided by time, that distance is equal to speed times time, and that time is equal to distance divided by speed. Travel graphs, you might need to work out the speed for particular parts of the journey. So remember the distance divided by time is your speed. Also, if it's a distance time graph and the graph is horizontal, that means the thing is stationary. Density, remember that density is equal to mass divided by volume. The pressure is equal to force divided by area. Translation, that's where we slide a shape on a grid and make sure you know your column vectors. The number on the top tells you if it's positive to the right, if it's negative to the left, and how many squares to the right and left. The number beneath that would be how many squares up if it's positive, and if it's negative, how many squares down. Reflections, make sure you can reflect shapes in the x-axis, the y-axis, lines such as x equals 4, x equals minus 1, or y equals 3. Also the diagonal lines, y equals x and y equals minus x. Rotations, make sure you get that tracing paper and you can rotate shapes on grids. Enlargements, make sure you can mark on where the center of enlargement is on a grid and make sure you can enlarge shapes on grids. Parts of the circle, make sure you know all the different parts of the circle, such as the arc and the sector and the segment and the tangent and the radius and the diameter and so on. The circumference, pi times diameter. The area of a circle, pi r squared. Make sure you can find the length of arcs, so for instance quarter circle, semicircle, things like that, and the areas of sectors as well. Pythagoras' theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Trigonometry, remember your two old angels skipped over heaven carrying a harp, or your SOHCAHTOA, and make sure you know how to do those trigonometry questions. Your exact trig values, they can be quite useful to know those as well. Similar shapes, so remember similar shapes means an enlargement, so if you find the scale factor of enlargement, you should be able to find the length of the missing sides. Congruent triangles, remember congruent means the same shape and size, so with congruent shapes you might need to identify which shapes are congruent on a grid, but also for your triangles, remember your side, 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 your angle, side, angle, your side, angle, side, and your right angle, hypotenuse, side. Volume of a cuboid, length times width times height, and the volume of a prism, which is the area of the cross section, times the length. The volume of a cylinder, the area of the circle, times the length. The volume of a sphere and the volume of a cone, those formulae are given to you in the front, so make sure you know where they are and you can use them. And same thing for the surface area of a sphere and a cone. Surface area, make sure you get area of all the faces and add them up. And vectors, make sure you know how to represent vectors and also how to write them as column vectors and answer questions like that. So hopefully this has been useful for you.